How is everyone? Nice and cool, I hope. This looks like a typical Sunday service here. There's a saying, they roll the sidewalks up in Truro at 7, except we don't have any sidewalks. It takes David Korn, I guess, to get everybody out of the woods. And he's done a fabulous job. I'm just sorry it looks like some folks are going to have to stand because we're not permitted to have any seating in the balcony area. So we have to make do. Since I see so many new faces here, I'd like just to say a word or two, you might be interested, about this building and graveyard. I'm John Marksbury. I'm chair of the Friends of the Truro Meeting House, and we're a support group for this building that was started when the town agreed to provide public funding for the restoration of this building, built in 1827. So over a 5-year period, the voters of Truro, through the Community Preservation Act, funded over $850,000 for the restoration of this building. And in addition to that, many donors gave over $80,000 to on top of that. We had a nice treat. I hope all of you heard the bell ring. That's not just any bell. That's a Revere bell, one of the last cast by the Revere Foundry. So it's a rare treasure. It was not in working order. Yes, that bell was not in working order. Somewhat like the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Fortunately, we didn't have a crack, or it wouldn't be ringing tonight. But there is one foundry in the entire United States capable of restoring it, and they did a beautiful job. The meeting house was established for the first congregational parish. Every town, in order to be a town, had to have a congregational church in those days. And for several years before Town Hall was built, the town meetings were held in this very building. As part of the mission of the Friends, in addition to preserving this historic landmark, we offer a number of programs every year to offer this beautiful space as a community resource. So we have every year a dozen or so fine musical events and talks such as this one tonight. The programs will end next Sunday. Guy Fishman, the principal chair of the cello of the Handel and Haydn Society, will be doing a concert with 3 Bach cello suites. And he will be joined by one of his students, Saskia Keller, who is a Truro resident and studied with Guy when she was at Harvard. One other thing, restrooms in the southeast corner of this building. It's a unisex restroom. Tonight's speaker, David Korn, I think appropriately enough, followed a talk we had 2 nights ago by Boston historian Robert Allison, who talked about 1768. It's the 250th anniversary of the landing of British troops in Boston and began their 8-year occupation of Boston. There were tensions aplenty, as you can well imagine. So tonight we're hearing from the esteemed journalist David Korn, who's the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones. He's a political commentator frequently seen on MSNBC and on CNN. David recently published a book which I found totally absorbing and learned so much from reading it. Russian Roulette, the inside story of how Russia declared Russia's
The inside story of Putin's attack on America.
Putin's attack and the election of Donald Trump. Thank you to the author. With Michael Isikoff. David also has to his credits 47%. He was the one who uncovered the video of Mitt Romney making the 47% speech at a Miami cocktail party. And of course, more recently, on October 31, was that Halloween actually? He broke the story about the Christopher Steele dossier for Mother Jones. He is also the author, with Michael Isikoff, of Hubris. He also, in addition, wrote The Lies of George W. Bush. And he's also a novelist, and won the George Polk Award for his novel Deep Background, which is the story of a conspiracy afoot after the President of the United States is assassinated at a press conference. I'm going to get out of the way now. I just urge all of you, before you leave, lighten your wallets with a little something for the friends of the Truro Meeting House and the glass vases at the end of this room.
But it is an honor to be anywhere where a revere bell can be rung for you and for us. And I think the ringing of that type of bell these days is about as good a metaphor as you can ask for. So thank you, whoever was pulling those strings. I want to thank John and Chuck for organizing this great event and bringing me to such a historic site. I want to thank Bobby Shapiro and Liz Nesson, who were my hosts up in Truro for the last week. My family has been coming here for about 18 years. We love it, but we still are outsiders because I've never driven past this place once in all that time. It's just not on the way to Cornhill Beach, Boston, or the ponds. And thanks for coming out on what is somewhat of a hot night. This scene reminds me a little bit of the trial scene in To Kill a Mockingbird. Except there's nobody up in the top. Just, hey, Scout. Okay. Oh. I get very nervous, and this is an antique. Maybe Paul Revere did something with this. Anyway, thanks for being here, and that was fun. Bye. I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then we're going to take some questions. There's a mic up here, so please, and when we get to the questions, please make them questions, or at least try to make a good-hearted effort not to make a speech. That's what I get to do, and they can be about anything. I'm going to start off by talking about the book I just put out, which I understand is available for sale, and also if you brought copies, I'm happy to stick around and sign anything you want, book, snorkeling equipment, whatever you might have with you. This is a book that I wrote with Michael Isikoff, who is the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, and he and I did write a book about 12 years ago called Hubris, the inside story of spin, scandal, and the selling of the Iraq War. And it took us about 12 years to get around to writing another book together after that experience. And today, he's at the East Hampton Literary Festival. And he's hanging out with Alec Baldwin. But I would rather be here. Okay? Forget the 1%ers in the Hamptons. I'm for the 1%ers on Cape Cod. Okay? The ones with a true conscience. Anyway, we did this book. It's called Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. And it came out in March. We began working on it in January of 2017, just as a new president was moving into office. And by the way, is anyone secretly recording this today? I hope so. And if you don't know what the joke is, that means you've done a good job of staying away from Twitter today. So congratulations, you can look it up later. And we started working in January 2017, and the book came out in beginning of March of 2018. And we had both been covering, to some extent, the story of the Russian intervention in the U.S. election. I have used the word meddling in the past, but I have now encouraged people to stop using the word meddling. That's kind of what a mother-in-law does, or father-in-law, to be gender neutral here. What the Russians did was not meddling. It was intervention. It was an attack. It was information warfare. And he and I had been writing about this a little bit during the campaign and in the transition period. But at the time, there was really not a lot of coverage. It was pretty amazing in retrospect. I felt like I was that crazy person on the street corner who no one pays attention to, which is kind of what it's like for me in my house. But anyway, in that, to me, this was the biggest political scandal in the history of the United States. It really dealt with a fundamental issue, which was the legitimacy of a presidential election. And, the Tea Party Dome, a few guys made some money, kickbacks, and even, in Watergate, you had a president knowing about a break-in, but it was a dumb break-in. It was really, really a dumb break-in. Nixon would have won, by 8 points, whatever it was, regardless of what happened with the dirty tricks. It didn't, although it led to led to his impeachment and his resignation, and was consequential that way, the act itself was pretty unconsequential, that it didn't change the results of what was going to happen. The Russian intervention in the 2016 election was not the determining factor. It was a determining factor. Very close election. You guys all know, 77,000 votes divided amongst 3 states a different way, and the election would have been totally different, and people would have seen, Donald Trump's candidacy as nothing more than a novelty rather than the beginning of fascism, or whatever you want to say, now. I mean, it's a very close call in terms of that. And because the election was so close, you can blame Hillary Clinton for a lot of things that could have been done differently. You can blame the media for how it did not cover Trump sufficiently prior to the election, and it did dwell upon Clinton's negatives far more than his. All these things you can blame, but the Russian attack was particularly, I think, significant because it came basically in 2 waves. I'm going to step back for a second. The Russians did 3 things during the campaign. They had 3 prongs on their attack. One was to sort of probe state election systems, to sort of see if they could get into them, and what they might be able to do down the road on election day, not so much to change results, but to make election day full of chaos. You go to your place to vote, and guess what? You're not registered, or your voter ID number has been last 2 digits have been transposed, and you can't vote, and people start questioning whether the election can be legitimate. They were doing that. They were doing everything that we now know through Facebook and Twitter trolls, and this group called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg they're creating Twitter personas that actually the Trump, and Trump people ended up retweeting. The Trump, Kellyanne Conway, Michael Flynn Jr., the head of social media for the Trump campaign, they all ended up retweeting Russian disinformation that was put out by the Internet Research Agency. And then there was the most, I think, significant part of their attack, which was the direct targeting of Democratic parties, including the Democratic Party and John Podesta, other people were aimed at, and some stuff was stolen from them, although it wasn't that significant. But penetrating the computer systems, the email systems of these targets, and then disseminating the material. And they did it, as you might remember, basically 2 times. 2 major blows. There were some minor blows in between. And the first one was at the Democratic Convention, and it created a big rift between Bernie people and Clinton people. And it's, maybe hard to remember now, but I was covering it at the time in Philadelphia. It really, well, let's put it this way. The Clinton people were scared that the convention was going to fall apart and blow up in acrimony and conflict. And, the only times a presidential candidate gets like the full attention of the national voting base is really kind of 4 times in a presidential campaign: your convention, and then the 3 debates you have with your opponent. So this threatened the first opening of those 4 events, and with the Bernie campaign staff and the Hillary Clinton staff working close together, they averted that, and the convention ended up fine for her. But then in October, on the same day that the grab them by the pussy tape came out, WikiLeaks started dumping John Podesta emails all about Hillary Clinton and her bank speeches and infighting in the Clinton regime, Clinton land. And what that did was, for 4 straight weeks, literally every day, there was a new batch of 2,000 to 3,000 documents from John Podesta's email box that gave the political reporters determining the coverage of the campaign material to write about, and made it very difficult for Hillary Clinton to put out a message, to talk about anything else. And what it really did, what their own posters and analysts discovered, was after a week or so of that, they were doing focus groups with voters in the swing states, swing voters in the swing states. And you got to wonder about people who, by that point, can't make up their mind between Trump and Clinton. But nevertheless, they would sit, they'd ask them questions about what was in the news that week, what they were thinking. And again and again and again, people kept saying, "I don't understand why we're hearing about her emails again. What's wrong? What did she do wrong? And why is she blaming the Russians for her own email problems?" And so what was happening was that swing voters, some of them low information voters, the type of voters that Donald Trump said he loved, were looking at headlines and seeing the word Clinton in email and not really understanding what this was all about. And it just reminded them of the email scandal that she had for using a private server. And that, in a lot of ways, was her biggest vulnerability with independent voters. They came to see the email server issue, controversy, as sort of the stand-in for believing she might be shifty, above the, not honest, above the rules, thought she could play outside the rules, do things on her own, sort of the traditional gripes that have been leveled, sometimes with justification, sometimes not, against the Clintons for years. And so the Russians got lucky. For 4 weeks, they completely amplified this vulnerability of hers, right up to the day that Jim Comey, told Congress that he was going to relook at the email server investigation because of new emails found what they thought might be new. So really, you think about 4 weeks of skewed media coverage for any candidate in a race that close. I'd have to say that you can come up with a list of 5, 10, 15, 20 factors of what might have, that if you flip them the other way might have changed the results of the election, and the Russian attack was one of them. And if you go back and look at the coverage of that in September, October of 2016, you'll find very little coverage of my God, the Russians are doing this. even when the U.S. government put out a statement in October 7th, after months of debating whether or not to do this in the White House, saying that the Russians were behind this attack. That just so happened to be the day that the Access Hollywood tape came up. And it never became an issue. Clinton tried to raise it at some debates, but the media and others just didn't pay attention to it. Other Democrats didn't zero in on this. And if you have the book, Chapter 14 goes into what Obama did and didn't do, and why he did what he did, and why he didn't do what he didn't do. And just the incredibly complicated position that the White House was in trying to figure out how to respond to this, with the assumption that she was going to win, so there was not an urgency to deal with it right before the election and perhaps cause a greater freakout and give more reason for Trump to claim the election was being rigged against him. So in any event, after all that, I felt like after Election Day, after 3 bottles of vodka, I really felt like a character in a Hitchcock movie. There's always the person who sees something that no one believes, like Rear Window, right? And am I the crazy one? How come nobody else sees? There's a murder right there, right in front of us. There's a body, and people are just stepping over it, going about their business. And the Democrats would say nothing about the Russian attack. The White House was really saying very little. And the media was stunned that Trump had won, and was focused on, whether Omarosa was going to get a job. Spoiler alert, she did. It didn't work out. And Mike and I, during the campaign, we had been really one of the few reporters to get even a little piece of what was going on with the Russians. He had done a story in September of 2016 about Carter Page, a advisor to the Trump campaign, a foreign policy advisor who had gone to Russia and met with Russians, and that was Russian officials. And he had sort of heard that, or figured out that the FBI was looking at that, and he was able to report that. And then at the end of October, I was able to report on the Steele memos, the first time anyone reported on that, and that the FBI was looking into those. But otherwise, there was precious little reporting. In fact, the same day, 2 hours after my story on the Steele memos came out, indeed on Halloween, the New York Times put out a story saying FBI finds no evidence of Trump-Russia links. Now, that's like saying 5 days or, into a year-long investigation, suspected target or subject investigation is found innocent because he hasn't been found guilty yet. They were talking about the very beginning of an FBI investigation that had not dug too deep, and now we see, the number of indictments there are and all the contexts that we have learned about. So they were completely misled and got it wrong, and still have trouble admitting that, although they are very happy to talk about the Pulitzer they got afterwards. I'm not bitter at all. But so, the story got more prominence as Trump got closer to becoming president, particularly when CNN reported that Trump had been briefed on the dossiers. Without getting into the content, and then that day BuzzFeed put the memos online, and everyone then learned about the P-tape and everything else. And the story kind of grew from there with the firing of, Jim Comey after he confirmed publicly what had been reported, according to unidentified sources, that there was indeed an investigation. And then you had the beginning of the Mueller investigation. So we thought that the whole story, at least at the time when we started the project, was already big and gigantic, and as I said a moment ago, consequential. And yet nobody really, I think, had a good idea of the full enormity of it. And we decided to write a book which we would advance the story where we could, and which we did manage to do, but also that would be, as of the time it gets published, a comprehensive, integrated narrative. Because we realized, and I realized this as I was talking to people throughout the year and after the book came out, that every day we're all being blasted, not by one, but by 27 or more different fire hoses of information. You know, and the Russia story is just really one of those. And the information comes out in a non-linear, non-chronological fashion. Here's something about the Trump Tower meeting. Here's something about Papadopoulos. Here's something about a meeting in Seychelles. There's a connection with a prince in the United Arab Emirates. And those of us who follow this have a hard time following it. And I think, you know, as I said, I think it's bigger and more unwieldy than Watergate. And also we live in an information culture now whereby we are bombarded with good and bad, important and insignificant information every nanosecond. So I thought it was really hard, I think, for people to fully understand what the story is about and all the various dimensions of it. For Trump, it goes back 30 years. His desire to do business in Russia and connections there that might have come to bear during the 2016 election. And in any event, we sort of ruined our lives in order to do this book on a very short timetable. And we came out the week that the House Intelligence Committee, run by Republicans, was shutting down their investigation. And I felt like, well, we got a report. And we had things, I mean, it was pretty unnerving to us that several Democrats on the committee told us after reading our book that we had things that they didn't know about. And I don't say this, you know, to blow our own horn here, but it's, I mean, we don't have subpoena power. They did, at least the Republicans on the committee did. And we've learned increasingly in the weeks since that they just have not, you know, they were not interested, of course. And they were just interested in covering up for Donald Trump. So I think we're at a point now where the story does get sort of daily coverage. A lot of it is focused still too much on sort of the play-by-play. You know, what is Rudy Giuliani saying today about whether Trump is going to sit down with Mueller? I mean, it may happen. I doubt it will happen. I think it's almost irrelevant if it happens because, you know, Donald Trump could not keep a story straight for 10 minutes. And, you know, to commit perjury, you have to know you're lying. And I don't know, reasonable doubt really could enter into that picture there. But I defer to the lawyers in the audience. So we still, I think, have, you know, don't focus enough on the big pictures. And I wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago. I try to talk about it whenever I go on MSNBC to talk about the shiny news object of the day. And that is, we already know that Trump is guilty. We already know that. What is he guilty of? Well, at least, as we put it in the book, aiding and abetting. Throughout the 2016 campaign, while Russia was waging information warfare against the United States, the Trump campaign and Trump himself did everything they could to make it easier for the Russians, to help them with their denials, to help with their cover-up, to basically reinforce their disinformation. Because, of course, they were saying, we're not doing this, which is what you would expect someone to say. If anybody out there was engaged in global disinformation, I would assume you would say, I'm not doing it. Otherwise, what's the point? But so the Trump campaign and Trump himself kept saying, we don't know, it's the Russians. The Democrats are making this up. In fact, the day that the Washington Post broke the story, it was a story that was given to them by the DNC, the Democratic Party, that they'd been hacked by hackers, who they had determined, or their experts had determined were Russians. The day after that comes out, the Trump campaign puts out a statement saying this is a hoax. The Democrats are making this up because they have such a weak candidate. Now, the interesting thing is, 5 days earlier, which is a short enough amount of time that even a Trump should be able to retain this. 5 days earlier was the Trump Tower meeting. June 9th, 2016, Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, in happier times, met with a Russian emissary whom they were told would bring them dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of a secret Kremlin effort to help the Trump campaign. This, by any stretch of definition, is what you might call collusion. Hey, I'm plotting to do something. Oh, come on in, let's talk about it. That's collusion. Now, the Trump people say that she ended up not giving them dirt and it didn't work out. Okay, so you failed at collusion, if you're right, if you're telling the truth. And now, we find out, Michael Cohen at least is willing to say that Trump knew about this meeting and knew what it was about. Okay, so you're meeting with a Russian emissary, you get an email that says it's part of a secret Kremlin plot, don't tell anybody. And then 5 days later, the news breaks that the Russians are hacking the Democratic Party. And you say, oh my God, this has to be a hoax. There's no way this could be happening. After being told the Russians had a secret plan to help you. And then, when the material comes out at the Democratic National Convention, you have Clinton people going on TV and saying, this is a Russian attack on democracy. And you have people like, I like Jake Tapper, but you say, oh, how do you know? How do you know? You're just trying to distract attention from this email that you don't like Bernie. But in any event, while the Clinton people are trying to raise the issue of a Russian attack on an American election, Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort both go out there and say, that's absurd. How can they say that? What do those two people have in common? They met with a Russian emissary who told them they had a Kremlin secret plan. So they're denying it. Mid-August, Donald Trump gets briefed by the intelligence community. All presidential candidates, presidential nominees get such briefings. And he is told that the intelligence community has already assessed initially that the Russians are behind this. What does he do? He goes out and says, oh, it's a 400-pound guy in his basement. You don't know, we don't know if it's the Russians. We don't know anything if it's the Russians or not. And he keeps denying, and of course that continues after Election Day. So look at it this way. There's a guy on a street corner. There's a bank being robbed. He's standing in front of the bank. Someone says, hey, bank's being robbed. He turns around, he sees guys, gals, with masks and guns in the bank. It looks like a robbery. People walk by, and he says, nothing's happening. Nothing to see. We don't know. It looks fine. Let's, move on. Move ahead. Now, he may not have been in on the caper to begin with, but he's certainly helping it now. And, under some definitions of criminal law, that would be aiding and abetting conspiracy after the fact. And in any event, in this instance, the guys who are robbing the bank are giving the money to the guy who says, I don't see anything. Right? It's for his benefit, whether he knows it or not. So Trump is guilty of aiding and abetting. And to me, that should be end of story part one. Forget whether there was collusion, whether he told the Russian hackers which particular emails to steal and when to leak them. You don't need that. He's already committed an act of betrayal. He is sided with a foreign foe while it was engaged in attacking the United States. And that's one of the big pictures that I do think we've lost sight of. I also think that, as with everything these days, his ability to say, the sky is green, the sky is green, the sky is green, as a way of affecting the debate. So there's a side that says the sky is green, there's a side that says the sky is blue. You know, it's up to you to decide. With his saying, you know, there's no collusion, and now saying collusion doesn't matter, or there might have been collusion, but it didn't work, or it might have not been so bad, and then there's nothing wrong with collusion. Whatever the line is of the day, which seems to come out of Rudy Giuliani mostly, there are some real issues with the act of collusion that we know that we know of. We know that by taking a meeting like that, what signal do you send to the Kremlin? Yeah, we don't mind. You know, this isn't going to trouble us if we win. While this is happening, in June, July, August, one foreign policy advisor in the Trump team, George Papadopoulos, is setting up back-channel communications, trying to establish a link between the Trump campaign and Putin's own office, while all this is in the news. So not only you're aiding and abetting, you are sending a signal. You are encouraging Russia to do this. We know from Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, he told the Washington Post a year ago that he had conversations with Michael Flynn during the campaign. Michael Flynn was the #1 security advisor, national security advisor to Trump. So if he's meeting with the Russian ambassador after learning, as he did with Trump, that the Russians are attacking, and while this is in the news, it's being reported at least that the Russians are probably behind this, and he's talking to Kislyak about sanctions, Syria, whatever, what message does that send to them that way? We don't mind. Now maybe it was even more explicit, like maybe it was, thank you very much. We don't know yet. But at the very least, the type of contact they had, Jeff Sessions meeting with Kislyak in September of 2016, was also, they're guilty. They're guilty of, you know, not of fraternizing with the enemy in a certain way that would send Russia a signal that you're not going to pay a price if you help Trump this way. And in fact, with Trump talking about improving relations with Russia, as this was ongoing, it might be seen as, oh, we got a little bit of a quid pro quo going here. If not explicit, and it might have even been explicit, certainly implicit. So that's something else they're guilty of. Obstruction of justice, you know, moving into the presidential campaign, presidential administration, excuse me. That's also something that we seem pretty readily guilty of, and there's just all this gaslighting. You know, I fired Trump, I fired Comey, Trump says, because of the Hillary Clinton emails. I felt so bad for the way the FBI treated her. Really. Although now he calls for an FBI investigation of that again. So that seems, you know, and again, whether it meets, you know, a legal definition of obstruction of justice, whether a president has, you know, can be found guilty of a criminal instance of obstruction of justice, that doesn't matter. He fired the guy who was investigating him and his crew. So, three really big picture items that totally get lost as we chase after what Michael Cohen is going to say today, or what the latest revelation is about Devin Nunes's weird, unexplained crusade to protect Trump. And I keep trying to get people to remember the big picture here. And that was one reason we, I think it's been so rewarding, this book experience. And I'll, finish in a few minutes and then we'll move to questions. I don't know about you, but I feel like my whole life is one nonstop hamster wheel. You live with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and everything else, and cable news. Everything comes and goes so quickly. And we get a lot of information now in really small 140 or 280 character bytes, and we move on quick. And it's really hard, and stories, the news cycle perishes, faster than sushi left out in the sun. It's, by the end of the day, you can't recall what we were talking about in the morning, and there have been 3 other crazy stories since then. I haven't checked my Twitter feed in the last 45 minutes. Who knows what we're missing? But I think we all get caught up on that. And what was interesting to me was a book about stuff that's in the news. Really asked people to take a step off the hamster wheel, to spend, depending on how fast you read, 8, 10, 16 hours, whatever it might be, to read a book and not, absorb all the tweets and news stories that are coming out that day or that week or that weekend. And our editor at 12, Mike and myself, we really questioned whether we could, insert a book into this raging, fire of crazy news, and have anyone decide that they will actually step off the hamster wheel for a short period of time and read a book about this subject. People are still reading biographies, histories, fiction, and all that, but read something about this subject and go into depth. And I was humbled by the fact that there were a couple 100,000 people who felt the need to do that. And when I travel and people come up to me who have read the book, I get a version, 10 out of 10 of them give me some version of this comment, which is, now I understand how it all fits together. Now I do see the big picture. And as news stories break about this on a daily or hourly basis, I understand the cosmology. I know where they fit in the... God, I am going to destroy this one. I know where they fit in the firmament. And it strikes me, this is just one subject that we should care about now, but that it's a little bit enlightening for me as a journalist and an author to see that there is an appetite for that, and I have a realization that a lot of people are trying to keep up and absorb things, but in this whack-a-mole media world that we live in, you all know what whack-a-mole is? Good. There's no boardwalk up here. It's really hard to get that depth of understanding. And I'm on MSNBC. I talk in sound bites. I do 5-minute segments, and I give a lot of credit to Rachel, who will walk through something. Right? Big hand for Rachel. She was fishing off Race Point just the other week, but we don't do that enough, and we don't do that in enough areas. And I think that's one reason our politics are in trouble. And I don't have a remedy for this. I'm a journalist. I don't necessarily do remedies. But it was something to think about. The ability to have a deep dive into an important issue that is happening around us at the moment doesn't come along too easily or too often. And it's not easy to present to people, not easy to get people to pay attention to. So Mike and I were incredibly gratified that people embraced a book of this nature. at this point in time. I'll finish off with like, where is this heading? I'm sure you all want to know where this is heading. And the answer is, I have no fucking idea. It's really it's my least favorite cliche that the tip of the iceberg is only 9 to 10% of the full iceberg. But I do think in this instance it's applicable. Robert Mueller investigation is a black box. We don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know what he's going to, what else he's looking at. We've been surprised numerous times by what he's been doing. And when we see signs of that, he's been very leak resistant. And the investigation could go on for a few more years. It could close down soon. We don't know. He's one misconception that a lot of people have. He's under no obligation to produce a public report at the end of his investigation. He's a special prosecutor. He is tasked with looking for crimes and prosecuting those crimes that he believes he has a reasonable chance of getting a guilty verdict on. And in the course of indictments and charges and putting information into evidence in trials is how he will share his information with the public. But if he finds things that don't lead to criminal indictments in criminal cases, he's under no obligation to make that public. If he discovers that Donald Trump got a loan from a Russian oligarch and saved his company 5 years ago, but it was all legal, he has no obligation to tell us that. He does have an obligation to give a report to Rod Rosenstein explaining his prosecutorial decisions, and that could be an expansive report or it could be very narrow. And then it would be up to Rosenstein to decide whether to make it public. If there's a Democratic-controlled Congress, they may demand to see it. I mean, it could come out. But at the end of the day, it's not Robert Mueller's job to tell us the full story. I think he'll try to find ways to tell us what he can. And that really was the job of Congress. And we know how that worked out on the House side. There's a Senate investigation ongoing, which looks to be in a better state, but probably still not as comprehensive as it should be. And there's no 9/11-like commission that Democrats have tried to push for in Congress that Republicans have blocked. So I still don't know, at the end of the day, if we're going to know all we need to know at the end of the day. That will make, we still do not have a system in place that has the task of informing the public everything that happened. And to me, that is some ways the scariest bit of all of this. I think a lot will come out. I think there's a lot of good fighting back and resistance, as people like to call it these days, on a lot of different fronts. I think for all the country has gone through in the last couple of years, there's still a lot of healthy aspects to our society and our political culture, as frayed as it is. I'm reading Ron Chernow's new book on Grant. He was the guy who wrote the book on Hamilton. I have a hard time reading it without thinking of songs. Like, how would you make the Battle of Shiloh into a song? But, in the 10 years before the Civil War, things were, were quite awful and quite divided, and, led to some of the worst bloodshed we've seen in this country. And I do think that understanding everything that happened in 2016, but also understanding all the other elements of the corruption of the Trump administration and the collaboration of the Republicans, what Wilbur Ross is doing, backdoor deals with corporations across America, secret plans to repress voters. Finding out all that is important too. So there's just a lot to unearth, a lot to uncover to get us to a place of perhaps political wellness. And but I do think people are pretty damn motivated to get to that spot. So even though I'm Jewish, as I noted earlier, I am some days almost mildly optimistic. So I encourage you on some days to be almost mildly optimistic. Okay, so now we're going to take a bunch of questions. As I said, I'll stick around early afterwards to sign, and if we don't get to your question, just tackle me afterwards, but just do it where it's sandy. Okay? So I think you need to go to the microphone, and just come up. If you have a question, just come up to the microphone, and I'll try to be not so long-winded, and please be so with the questions.
Hi. First, I want to say thank you very much. Thanks for being here and for writing the book and for all that you do.
Just tell me your name.
My name is Barbara Clipper. I live in Provincetown. And what I'd like to ask you about is to just hear your thoughts about the complicity of the GOP. Particularly Sarah Kendzior was talking this weekend about Lindsey Graham's turnaround, and it was sort of everybody's baffled with why do they support Trump so much.
Right.
And the whole idea that the RNC was hacked as well, and nothing's come out about that. Do you have anything? I'd like to hear your thoughts about all of that.
I think the simplest explanation is cowardice, not conspiracy. When it comes to why Republicans have so folded for Trump, Lindsey Graham called him a racist and a kook during the campaign. Literally today he said, I've never heard him say a racist thing. Ted Cruz, has done the same type of turnaround. And you have Paul Ryan and well, I know that McConnell openly calls Trump a moron when he talks about him privately. So why do they do this? I hate feeling naive after covering politics for several decades, but I really thought at the beginning of this that they would make common cause with Trump on tax cuts and deregulation and push back on other things, and at least to preserve the prerogatives of Congress. I mean, there's always been a fight between the executive branch and the legislative branch, particularly when the president of a party when it's the president of a party that controls the legislative branch. Democrats often were fighting with Clinton. Bob Kerrey, Democratic senator, nearly killed Bill Clinton's first budget. So there's a long tradition of this. And, I think the short answer is that they're scared of their own people. That the Republican Party has become so Trumpified, it's gone from Tea Party eyes to Trumpification. And that and I hear people say this, that they believe that if they turn on Trump, the Republican base will turn on them. And that they don't want to do that. And now, to me, the inexplicable thing is why people like Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, who are not running again, and McCain, when he was healthy, were not more oppositional. Like, Bob Corker does this thing. Like, if there's a scandal comes out in the Trump administration, and they go rushing to Bob Corker, the Republican senator from Tennessee, and he kind of says, God, I wish someone could do something about that. He's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He could do something about it. But I think ultimately it's cowardice, and I think it's also, you saw this with Justice Kennedy. I think these people are just old, tired, don't want to get involved in what they see as overly tribalized politics, and don't want to stand up for things that they used to say they believed in. It's really hard not to be quite cynical about this. I don't think it has anything to do with Russians blackmailing them. I think it's there's a bully, a demagogic authoritarian bully in charge of their party, and they've all become lapdogs. And I'm saddened by that. I really am.
I guess my question is, do you know a whole lot more than you put in the book? And that because there's three things that have been reported that I just don't make any sense to me. Where did Rex Tillerson come from? Where did Paul Manafort come from? And why was Oleg Deripaska's plane at every Trump rally?
It was a different Russian oligarch, not Deripaska. But okay, in the book we do report that one of Steele's last memos were Russian officials saying we got to do something about preventing Mitt Romney from becoming Secretary of State. And we don't know who said this, we don't know how accurate it is, We don't know if that had a role. I mean, I think there is no way in hell that Trump was ever going to name Mitt Romney Secretary of State. I think he just wanted to play him. It was, really, the first three explanations for anything that Donald Trump does, you have spite, and you have spite. It's simply, I can talk more about this, but but it's interesting to me that the Russians, of course, didn't want Mitt Romney. Whether that led to anything in putting Rex Tillerson there, we don't know. It's always something worth looking at. Paul Manafort was introduced to the Trump campaign by Tom Barrack and by Roger Stone. We do know that. And, he had been in Republican Party circles. It was, when he was hired, we have a scene in the book where a State Department official exclaims when Paul Manafort is hired for the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort, he's been a Russian stooge for years. So it was no secret. People knew that about him, and it was very surprising that they did that. But it wasn't surprising that through Roger Stone and Tom Barrack, that they would be bringing Manafort to Trump's attention. And of course, he agreed to work for $1 a year, which probably appealed to Trump a lot. And he had an apartment in Trump Tower. So that might have been all Trump needed. But his connection to Deripaska and the fact that his business partner was a former Russian military official who was talking to Deripaska for Manafort at that time, while Manafort owed Deripaska anywhere between $16 and $30 million, is really quite stunning in and of itself. The trial that he's going through now doesn't have a lot to do with that, but I'm still hoping we learn more about that connection. And finally, there was a Russian oligarch. Not every campaign stopped, but in the final weeks, 3, 4, 5 times, plane was at the same airport that Trump was at. And I don't know what the explanation is for that. There are other connections, too, between an Alpha Bank server, which is a big bank in Russia, and a server associated with a Trump business. The bottom line is I don't think there needed to be a lot of coordination. Trump, from the very beginning, had a psychological affinity for Putin. I don't think he needed to be blackmailed into this. He wants to be Putin. And he was talking about getting rid of sanctions in 2015. They interfered with the business deal he had. We explained this in the book. So things are going pretty well without, I think, anybody having to pull a lot of strings. So all worth looking at, but we still don't have any, clear evidence of a connection of that sort.
Hi. The Trump Organization by Donald Trump Jr. has all but admitted that after the American banks stopped lending to them, they were propped up by Russian oligarchs for years and went on a buying spree with cash, which is something that Donald Trump was totally uncharacteristic for Donald Trump. That both provides arguably motivation for cozying up to the Russians, and it also, there's potential money laundering involved in those kinds of things. Why are we reading more about that? Is Mueller following it, and is the press following it?
Donald Trump's finances are, to say the least, opaque. And there are a lot of puzzling elements to them. And of course, today would be a good day for him to release his tax returns, as would any day. And he hasn't. Whether that they would not necessarily tell us anything about Russian connections, but we do know that he has tried to do business in Russia for decades. That in 2007 or 8, Don Trump Jr. said a lot of money was coming into their properties from Russians. We know that Eric Trump said that their golf courses overseas were being financed by Russian money. And we know that there's this gigantic loan when the American companies finally realized that he was a bad business partner and stopped lending to him. He got $300 million and then more from Deutsche Bank. And not from the public side of Deutsche Bank, but from a private wealth fund at Deutsche Bank, which really is a lot of wealthy individuals or sovereign wealth funds from countries, giving money to Deutsche Bank to invest. And there's long been speculation that money, there might be Russian money there, Trump might know that, might not know it, loans might be backstopped by Russians. I and other reporters have spent hours and hours on this, and it's nearly impossible to get access to that information. German bank laws, American bank laws, a lot of this is beyond the SEC or the Federal Reserve, and you just can't tell. Donald Trump has 500 LLCs, limited corporations, for a lot of his, every deal is a different LLC. He could be parking debt and loans and a lot of those, and he doesn't really have to reveal that on his financial disclosure forms that he files as a presidential candidate or a president. So there is a lot there. I have reason to believe that Mueller is looking at some of that. How deeply he's going to go, this would, Trump himself has called this a red line. He gets in his finances. I was talking, to drop a name, I was talking to Mark Cuban a couple months ago, and he said, because I talked to him a little bit during the campaign. He knows Trump a bit, and we would talk about different aspects of Trump's business to try to look at from a journalistic perspective. And afterwards he said, I should have just spent $2 million on a team of forensic accountants. But even without subpoena power, they would have a very difficult time. So I do think, and so why is there not more in the media? It's really hard to prove. We try to prove these things. I know a lot of reporters working on this. And unless you can, confirm it. I mean, I have guys who work in Russian finance who tell me really amazing things about Trump finances. I don't know if it's true. I can't prove it. So that's one reason you don't hear, but it is something that people look at, and I assume Mueller's looking at some of it.
Do you think that there might be a deeper coordination between the Kushner digital campaign, Cambridge Analytica, and possible specific hackers that targeted voters through Facebook?
That's a real good question. We at Mother Jones did a story that showed that to a certain extent Cambridge Analytica was like a big con. A lot of campaigns that hired them before the Trump campaign, like the Cruz campaign, were sold a whole bill of goods. We can do big data, we can identify voters, we can move voters' impressions, and they came to believe that it was all talk. And it's so to me it's still they stole data, or they got data improperly from Facebook. They used it. The transmission between them and the Trump campaign used Facebook really well. I mean, and I think, accurately attribute their win to their use of Facebook. Now, to what degree that was it helped by Cambridge Analytica? Cambridge Analytica was bragging about that. I still don't know. And there's also the question about whether the Russian social media campaign had any interaction with the Trump campaign or Cambridge Analytica. And all I can say about that is, again, it's something that should be looked into. It doesn't, on its face, I could see the reason for saying, well, no, they don't have to have that coordination to do what they did. Some of their targeting was smart, but they also targeted like Connecticut in the last week. And I was talking to someone from the CIA about this. And I asked, do you think the Russian social media campaign needed help from America, from someone in the Trump camp? And he said, listen, I can tell you that if the CIA was doing something like this in another country, we wouldn't need help. You can look at Politico and come up with the top 25 districts. You can do, a lot of this stuff is out there, and the people who work at the Internet Research Agency, who were doing this in Estonia, doing this in Ukraine, it's not rocket science. So I'm not saying that there wasn't, and I wish that and this may be something that Mueller's looking into, I don't know. There's not a public sign of that yet. But it is something that deserves probing. But on its face, it could have happened with or without. We do see Russian involvement with Brexit, right? And so that's, with some of the funders of Brexit. And you have Cambridge Analytica with Steve Bannon and the Mercers being involved behind that. And they were tied to Cruz, then they're tied to Trump. There's I do this. And believe me, I get many emails with dots and lines and dots and lines and dots and lines. And those, I always call that a starting point. That maybe that line is what you think it is. It could be something completely different. But these are connections that we don't fully understand yet.
I have a two-part question. The first question is, how do you think that, sort of in reference to the answer you just gave to the last question, how do you feel that the Russian interference in the U.S. election compares with the U.S.'s long history of interference with democratically elected governments in other countries? And second of all, sort of a perspective on the sort of precedent for interfering in democratic elections in other countries that the U.S., along with many other countries, including Russia, has set previously, is not really something that's been discussed a lot in the media discussions of potential Russian interference in the U.S. election. And in what ways do you feel that it might impact discussions of how to prevent this in the future if we were sort of to go with more of a broader historical perspective on what led up to this?
Well, I've written other books that go into what's happened in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, Vietnam, where we sponsored a coup, and we have a long history of that type of intervention and anti-democratic action. To me, I'm still amazed that Henry Kissinger walks free. That's just me. So there is a history of U.S. doing this. Now, what does that mean for what happened in 2016? I don't think it means that that it's any less evil or worse when it's done to us. And I don't blame, a repressive leader like Putin for trying to do something like this. We expect this. He does this in other nations, and he's invaded Ukraine. So you can't blame the scorpion for the sting. But what you can hold accountable are leaders and officials and participants. So the Republicans in Congress, Trump and his campaign, for enabling this intervention. I mean, in the Clinton years, actually, and in Obama years too, I have friends who work on this, there's been a lot of reconciliation in dealing with Chile and Guatemala, El Salvador, and places where the U.S. has a stained history, and returning documents and helping them come to terms, and in some cases even issuing apologies, official apologies. So,
what about Honduras? What about Honduras, where we supported a military coup?
Yeah. I mean, we haven't done this everywhere. Okay, we haven't gone back to every historical blemish, but more than most countries, more than Russia and China and other countries that have engaged in this, North Korea, under at least democratic presidents, we have faced up to some of this. And I think that, Clinton and Obama did not get enough credit for that. So I do think, listen, Gore Vidal had a great name for this country. He called it the United States of amnesia. Right? And it's true. I mean, you can talk about how come we don't talk about the Native American genocide more often. There are a lot of things we've done that we've not come to terms with. But we need at least a dual-track system of working on those and educating the public and remaining educated ourselves past misdeeds, but also, protecting our democracy from outside attack. I mean, that just seems commonsensical to me, and one should not distract from the other.
I don't want you to think I'm trying to put you on the spot, but here...
I'm under a cross.
I know. And I think you're, preaching to the converted here.
Yeah.
Have you had an opportunity to speak to a group of people in a so-called red zone? And how has that happened? Or is that wishing something that you don't want to have happen? I mean, I really need to understand how Trump even got past his opening speech.
Yeah.
How that didn't disqualify him across the board, I will never be able to understand. So what do we do now? I think we have to reach the other people. What scares me is how many of them are out there and how vocal they are and how committed in this part of the world. Everything's, it's easy. It's not easy to avoid it, but we're living in good company. And I want to know how to reach the other people and if you've had a chance to do that. And I don't mean to say you're not, but...
I get this question a lot, and some days, sometimes just on the street, when I'm walking down the street in Washington, it happens a lot, and often I feel like a grief counselor. Because I do think we're all going through something akin to trauma. And I mean that seriously. I'm not belittling your feeling. And I'll say, I've spent, how long has it been, Bobby? 40 years? Jesus. 40 years or so covering politics. And I've always tried to understand why voters vote the way they vote. I've tried to be not judgmental, but to understand why they're doing this, why they're voting for Reagan or George W. Bush, especially the second time. And, I go out, I talk to voters often during campaign season. And like you, this time, I don't understand how you can look at Donald Trump and listen to him for roughly 13, 14 seconds and not come to the conclusion that he's a con man who's playing you and cares only about himself. This is where I feel there's a tremendous disconnect. I could understand why people would fall for the Reagan shtick. I could understand why people, would go for George W. Bush over Al Gore. I get it. I don't agree, but I can see sort of how sane, rational people who care about a certain set of issues or a certain type of country could make those decisions. Here, I'm kind of in the dark. I can understand some of the negative reasons, like people, I don't think it's economic resentment. I think it's cultural resentment with a lot of race thrown in for a lot of people. And they just want somebody, they're voting their anger and their resentment, and that's all they care about. And anyone who's ever been married knows that it's when someone gets angry, they sometimes don't make the best decisions. The last thing in the world you can do is tell them not to be angry, because that only makes them angrier. And there was just so much anger out there that he was able to exploit and capitalize on. And I do think that this is outside the normal confines of political discourse and debate. Therefore, you can't reach a lot of these people. I hate to say that. I don't think they're reachable. If you believe Barack Obama was born in Kenya, if you believe Donald Trump, as 43% of Republicans last week in one poll, I don't know, I didn't pay attention to it too closely, if they would support Trump if he shut down a media outfit that he thought was reporting irresponsibly. People who believe in various conspiracy theories. Basically anybody who watches Fox, who really believes in a deep state conspiracy to get Trump, and that literally everybody's part of that. I don't know how you reach these people. The good news is you don't have to. 65.5 million to 63 million. Now the fact, those 63 million are not all in this category. A lot of them are just Republicans or independents who hated Hillary. They may not have been racist. They may have just been misogynistic. So maybe they'll grow out of that. But in any event, a third of the electorate or whatever are, Fox News deep state Trumpers who cannot be reasoned with. And doing our book tour was basically MSNBC, CNN, NPR, back to MSNBC, CNN, MSNBC for like 2 weeks. And we tried to get on Fox, why not? And finally, Mike Isikoff got booked on like the 11 o'clock show, but they only wanted him. And then he got booked on like a 7 a.m. weekend show. I go, you can take that. They only wanted him. Tucker, I've known Tucker for 30 years. I've known Hannity that long too. They didn't put us on. They found one paragraph in the book about the Obama campaign hiring Fusion GPS, which paid for the Steele memos, in 2012, and they went crazy. Obama connected to Steele memos. Yeah, 4 years before they were written, maybe, yeah. And they did what they could about that, but they wouldn't have us on. Our booker, our publicist kept trying. So I would gladly talk to folks on the other side, but I really think we've hit a bit of a dead end in our political culture. I think we need a reset. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And again, I told you, I was reading this book about the Civil War, the 10 years up, preceding the Civil War. It was quite the big question, of course, was slavery. And there wasn't a lot of civil discourse about that. In fact, there was, one senator nearly killed another senator who made an abolitionist speech by caning him. Right? So I think now, if you have people you can talk to, we all know friends who have voted for Trump and we don't understand why they did that. And I try to talk to folks that way, respectfully, and I don't see an opening for persuasion. There are some, people who work at Harley-Davidson plants, and, people, lobstermen up in Maine, the guys who make the lobster traps, they're all being fucking screwed now. And a lot of them still say, well, I'm sticking with them, but not all of them. And I don't know if they'll stick with him for 2-3 more years. So I don't have a good prescription for how to preach to the non-converted, but I do know that if you mobilize the converted, we do outnumber them. We're not in a bubble. And if we are in a bubble, it's a bigger bubble than their bubble. So I feel
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
My name is Seth Goldstein, and what I wanted to bring up to you were 2 other books. One is It Can't Happen Here with Sinclair Lewis, and A Plot Against America by Philip Roth. And
I love both of those books. They're great books.
And they're relevant today because what I'm seeing, and I don't know if anybody else here is seeing, is a rise of fascism in the United States. And I feel sometimes that I'm looking at the 1930s instead of the 1960s or 70s or 80s. With kids being locked up in cages, with families being separated, I'm going to tell you right now, I think Himmler would be very happy with that. And from that perspective, with Putin, who seems to be pushing a right-wing type of fascism worldwide, and questions of, and I have a question of whether or not if Donald Trump was president in 1940, if he'd be cutting deals with Adolf Hitler. That's my concern. And I'm just very concerned that unless we become anti-fascists, whether or not we're going to be able to beat this, because it's very deep.
Yeah, it can't happen here, and The Plot Against America are wonderful books. I actually tried to make a movie out of It Can't Happen Here a few years ago, and I was competing with Richard Dreyfuss for the rights, and neither of us could get them because the literary estate of Sinclair Lewis was so screwed up. I'm of two minds on this. I see creeping autocracy and creeping authoritarianism. I see a cult of personality, all the warning signs of fascism. You know, I do see them out there. At the same time, I see differences. I see economic condition that's a lot different than previous fascists have been able to exploit in other countries. I do see a educated, mobilized citizenry that does believe in tolerance and diversity. I see kids being locked up in cages. I see tremendous demonstrations against that. I see even Republicans getting worried about that. I see tremendous gun violence. I see my 17-year-old daughter leading the high school walkouts in support of the Parkland kids. I see the Parkland kids. I've been fortunate enough to meet some of them and be in green rooms with them. And I am stunned by their sophistication and articulateness, and how they are savvy in terms of their political strategy and their messaging. There is a fine line between seeing warning signs and becoming, and having the sufficient amount of alarm. What happened in Nazi Germany was very particular to Nazi Germany, and I do, from a purely political perspective, I do think that sometimes, language that is very harsh can put off some people. Fascism, Nazism, those are big terms. And there are plenty of other terms to use that are just as accurate and just as powerful. So, I love those books. I think all the time about, how you get from, in a fascist society from point A, to point Z, and what all the things that happen to be in between, and the deterioration of rights and norms, which we do see to an extent now. We see a tremendous attack, something that I care a lot about, on the media, right? It's very significant, it's very important. We have not seen, yet, people in brown shirts running to the offices of BuzzFeed and throwing their computers out the window. That hasn't happened, and I think we're not close to that. I might be wrong. So all in all, I don't have a clear answer on this important question. I wrestle with it. I'm sure a lot of people do too. But we need to be clear-eyed in what we see, and we need, not to. You get clear-eyed and accurate without being frightening in a way that people might dismiss you. It's a difficult balance. It's a difficult recipe. People are going to draw the lines at different places. I'm not a big fan of talking about impeachment now. I just am not. I think the whole ball game is the Democrats getting the House back or not. They get back the House. They have at least 20 legitimate investigations. They can mount half the cabinet. The Russia stuff again, nepotism, security clearances. Omarosa gave them a whole new investigation just today, stupidly, thought she was helping herself, but, and that by doing that, you would totally pin down an already incompetent White House and for a year into, the next campaign. And that you don't have to get into the hot button issue of impeachment, which could actually, in some ways, help Trump with his base. So that's what I mean. You just, impeachment, I think, on its terms could be justified, but politically, I'm about figuring out what's the most effective way to move forward. And people are going to debate that. Democrats are going to debate that in primaries and elections. And we need to have those discussions and still, without letting those discussions become the tail that wagged a dog. So let me, if there are no further questions. Do you have a question?
David, I think we're going to have to call it a close. Okay. David has kindly agreed to stay and sign books afterwards. I failed to mention earlier that the co-presenter of tonight's talk is the Truro Public Library.
Oh, yeah!
I especially want to thank the librarian, terrific librarian, Tricia Ford, and her two staff members, Galen Malakote and Peter Thrasher. Thank you.
And let me just say in closing, thank you, John and Chuck, again. Thanks to the Truro Library, it saved my butt many rainy days when my kids were very small. So we really appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to Guy Strauss, who's, some of you may know him. He's no longer with us. He started the Pyramid Tent. He really was the first guy to get me to speak up here many years ago. And whenever I'm up here, I miss him greatly. But he was really keen on keeping conversations like this alive. And again, I would ask everyone to be, on some days, almost mildly optimistic, because you guys know more about the tide than I do, and it doesn't go in just one direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.